nationalizing language and culture, because language is not just a cybernetic code for transmitting information. It's an ambience for understanding. It is the operating system of our minds. It's the DNA of our identity. That is what Romantics began to think in the early 19th century. And that is why Prudence van Duysen, after the end of the United Kingdom, could come with his beautiful variation on Buffon's notion, le style c'est le même, and saying de taal is gans het volk. It sums up what Jacob Grimm would say, who defines a nation als der Inbegriff aller derjenigen, die eine selbe Sprache sprechen. Nowadays we realize, and certainly if we do this comparatively, that a language, as Andrew Wachtel said about Yugoslavia, is not only capable of making a nation, but also of breaking a nation. And making a nation or breaking a nation is what happened to language policies and language dynamics in this very, very complex part of Europe. And I'm not being flippant when I say that there are many, many structural similarities between the Low Countries and the Balkans or Southeast Europe. If we look at the extreme political instability of borders and state formations between 1793 and 1890, Yugoslavia is a very, very close analogy. And we now live, if you like, in a Benelux that's very closely resembling Slovenia, Croatia, and Serbia. And I'll leave it to you to work out which country is which analogy. We tend to look at the very, very complex beginnings of this complex system of languages and states through the glasses of political antagonisms that arose very strongly within Belgium after the mid-1830s. Belgium, from the late 1830s onwards, defined a master narrative as the clash of civilizations between the two language communities. And it is very, very easy to see that also as, to use that as the lens through which we see all of the history of all of the Low Countries for all of its time. And this is how we generally tend to see Kinker as, you know, some sort of a Schwarzenegger of the language, and that there was already a language war going on, etc. I'm going to try and slightly modify and complicate that view. And one thing I would like to apply is something that we have learned from comparatism as a transnational principle, and that is, if we make transnational comparisons, if we study not a single case country in what we now call methodological nationalism, but if we situate the country in a wider context, in this case Northwest Europe, the dynamics we see work through at all levels, as cultural transfers across national borders, across states' borders, as regional dynamics within a country, and even as dynamics at city level. Most cities, not just nowadays, but from the Middle Ages onwards, are multi-ethnic. Most cities are multilingual and have a varied hinterland of different regions, and a constantly fluid population of people who move in and who are not yet habituated to the language patterns and palettes of the main cities. This goes for Venice, for Vienna, for Amsterdam, and to some extent also for the cities around here. So multi-ethnicity, multilingualism is not just something that makes or breaks nations, but that also affects regions and cities. And this part of Europe was, by, you know, par excellence, together with northern Italy, a region of city cultures. The strongest aggregations of culture were at city levels. The longest living institutions that we have, the schools that date back to the Middle Ages, that are older than universities, the hospitals are medieval foundations. And city culture was very, very strong also at remembering their viri illustres, their famous science. So Petrarch or Erasmus or people like that are commemorated in Rotterdam, in their native cities. In a cult of commemoration that only in the 19th century becomes national. We might even say that the nation cannibalizes city culture in the 19th century to develop its national historicism. Now, so here I'm already actually beginning to launch into what will be roughly the set of assumptions that I want to work through in my lecture, and I'll come back to it at the end, and I hope they'll make more sense after I've given a few examples. That nation formation is a multiscalar process. It doesn't take place tabula rasa somewhere in New Zealand, where even Maoris were there before the modern state formation took place, but it takes place in a landscape that is already thickly set with regional, confessional, religious and civic identities. So the nation has to establish itself within a very crowded field. The cities are not just the squares on the chessboard on which nation formation is played out, they're part of the pieces of the chess pieces. Nation formation needs to negotiate regional identities and can upscale or cannibalize central city cultures that become central to the national self-understanding. I will give you one or two examples. In Holland, the cult of Vondel is extremely important as a hypercanonical presence. It begins as an Amsterdam city culture. Gijsbrecht van Amstel is the inaugural piece for the city, the city playhouse that is built in the 17th century. And when the play is performed every 1st of January, that is an Amsterdam festival for the Amsterdam citizens. And when the famous lines, de liefde tot zijn land is ieder aangeboren, are spoken towards the end of this play, the notion of the patriotism and the love of the fatherland is applied by every Amsterdammer purely in a municipal sense. We love our fatherland, i.e. our city. This is campanilisme. This is a local identity. In the 19th century, when a statue for Vondel is built in the new part of Amsterdam called the Vondelpark, it's a national statue. And when at that moment the words de liefde tot zijn land is ieder aangeboren are repeated, we mean by land the Netherlands. So there is an upscaling of Vondel from a city canonicity to a national canonicity. Holland, the Netherlands, piggybacks onto Amsterdam. The way Belgium or Flanders piggybacks onto Rubens, who is an Antwerp hero before he becomes a Belgian hero, or France piggybacks onto Orléans when La Pucelle d'Orléans, who is already celebrated in yearly homilies in Orléans throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, in the 19th century suddenly becomes a national heroine of the nation of France as a reconciliation figure between church and state in that very fraught period. So in many cases we could say that the new national cultures of the 19th century, even if they invoke medieval or early modern examples, are basically trying to borrow that historical glamour, that historical prestige from the much longer standing memory cultures at city level. And the cities that manage to buy into this new national canonicity become central. Leiden is a good example. It has a university, it has Burgemeester van der Werf, and what is initially a civic municipal Leiden Memory Festival, the 3rd of October, becomes a national Dutch festival in the course of the 19th century. If you're not part of that happy, top inner circle of cities that go national, you become a strange sort of provincial city. And I have a PhD project now running trying to compare what's happening in Maastricht, Bruges and Leeuwarden, in cities that have a very strong, long-standing, local civic culture. But they do not get national institutions. As we heard from Gita, Bruges fails to get a university. They might still have bishops or something that's not national, but what do they do with their city cultures? And what does Liège do with its city culture? What happens in these contested areas where in this complex system of identities and nations, some cities don't make it to the central national canon? What happens to their marginalization? My working assumption will be that municipal frames of cultural production, and by cultural production I mean two things: artistic production, the writing of literature, cultural festivals, that sort of stuff, and knowledge production, that is to say disquisitions, archaeology, and antiquarianism, history writing, that sort of stuff. So cultural production in cities are very weak, and they are overtaken by the much stronger frames of cultural production that are working under state auspices, under national auspices. Okay, so much for my assumption. This is a teaser. This is something that happens in cities a long way away. I mean, Holland and Belgium are not the only places where problems are around. This is an interesting sort of stuff happening. You know, you heard about it in the news. I'll come back to, you know, something that can happen in city culture elsewhere. But I'll come back to that at the end. Let's forget about it now. We're going to talk about Willem I and about a very, very interesting thing that he does, namely to found universities, because that's what we're commemorating here. We've heard a lot of things about it already in how we can contextualize that. I would like to see the foundation of universities as deliberate political moves for dynastic power establishment. And it already goes back to pre-modern times, as I'll try to argue. But of course, Ghent, Leuven and Luik, we've talked about it at great length there. Earlier deliberations are the immediate aftershock of something that's already happening just across the border, and we need to remember that Willem is the son-in-law and the brother-in-law of kings of Prussia, so there's a very, very close alignment between his policies and those of Prussia. Prussia against Napoleon and in establishing its own post-Napoleonic identity begins with the mother of all 19th century universities, Humboldt's foundation in Berlin, 1810. And very early on, the Humboldt template is applied in the peripheral areas of Prussia. Silesia in Breslau, which is now Wrocław, where there had been a university as soon as Silesia became Prussian in 1702, but it's rebooted in this new, so rebooting the way Louvain is rebooted in the 19th century in 1811. And a few years later, when at the Congress of Vienna, Prussia obtains the Rhineland, the first thing they do is they put a university as close to Cologne as they dare to do it. I think that's basically decides the choice of Bonn. Cologne is still the city of the old archbishops. Prussia will try to do something there in trying to restore the cathedral and to rebuild the cathedral of Cologne, but that comes later. As yet, Cologne is not quite happy to become under Protestant Prussian rule, but they will put a power base on the Rhine, just a few miles south, and they appoint Ernst Moritz Arndt, the great architect of national thought in Germany, as one of the prominent professors. And so there's, you know, a fifth column of hardcore Prussian intellectuals on the Rhine, August Wilhelm Schlegel, the way they will do it in Strasbourg when they annex Alsace-Lorraine in 1871. So this type of power place is part of the 19th century, and we might see Willem's foundations in the southern Netherlands, not just as you know, something that is pragmatic and fair because the people there need their universities too, but also as anchoring points for his rule in these new as rivets to hold his new territory together. I would even argue that he's following a certain strange historicism on his own part. Willem is a totally unimaginative, technocratic, you know, engineer of societies. He runs the Netherlands as if it was his own farming estate. He digs canals, and you know, he's a very and he's you know, textile factories, etc., etc. He's a very conscientious manager, but he, you know, when we see what we see him doing there is not really what is highest on his agenda. He's not really a Ludwig of Bavaria, for instance, who's real romantic on the throne. At the same time, my hunch is that he has a very, very strong dynastic historicism. He is acutely aware that he is Prince of Orange-Nassau. And although as a sovereign prince or as a king of this newfangled country, he's a bit of an Emperor Bokassa in the New Europe, and it's, you know, it's not quite the title that the others have. It's his real aristocratic title as Prince of Orange-Nassau, his, you know, Je maintiendrai, that is really, really strong. And he sees himself as the avatar or as the successor of earlier rulers, and particularly he sees his own new kingdom as the reincarnation of the Burgundian Netherlands, with the addition of Liège, of course. And I think in order to incorporate Liège into this neo-Burgundian scheme, it's a no-brainer that certainly a university will have to come here. My main indication for the idea that there is a strong historicism at work in the way Willem wants to organize his new territories on a Burgundian template lies in the fact that he gives a totally idiotic and ridiculous name to your neighboring province, that of Limburg. Limburg is a new-fangled construct. It was a totally disparate, scattered set of small lordships in the Ancien Régime. The French had sort of grouped it together into a département de la Meuse inférieure. And when Willem inherited it, the question is, what are we going to do with this? Well, they took it over more or less as is. Interestingly enough, I should say that in creating the Département de la Meuse Inférieure, the French were already beginning to apply certain cultural principles in their political organization of the territory. When they decide where the border will be between the Département de l'Ourthe and the Département de la Meuse Inférieure, the commissioners for the Directoire, who have to give reports in order to establish where the demarcation should be, report that Visé, because it is a francophone city and feels itself close to Liège, does not want to become part of the new Département de la Meuse Inférieure. Par contre, Hasselt and Tongres are reported to feel totally antagonistic towards Liège because they don't speak the same language, and they much more prefer to be not part of a Liège-governed province. So already here we see that loyalties, cultural sense of kinship is at work in, creating a frontier between the Ourthe and the Meuse Inférieure, which is very, very roughly based on linguistic considerations. And it will become, of course, much more of a hard border in 1830, 1839, and these little decisions in 1793, 4 or 5 will have far-reaching consequences in the 19th and 20th century. But enough of that. There is this new province. What are they going to call it? Are they going? Utrecht is called Utrecht after the capital. Groningen is called Groningen after the capital. Antwerp is called Antwerp after the capital. Are they going to call it the Departement Maastricht? That was the suggestion. And in his own hand, Willem will cross that out and said, "De naam Maastricht mishaagt mij." I love that phrase. Because if you do this, the ancient duchy of Limburg, which was one of the titles of the Dukes of Burgundy and of Brabant, would disappear. And so he decides to call this new, totally artificial province, this Flevoland of the 19th century, a very old historical name, which territorially is miles away. It was in Limburg on the Vesdre. It was a little duchy, north of Arlon. It had absolutely practically no territorial contiguity, maybe a couple of acres or something, and certainly not with the county of Loos, which now is called Limburg, and which is really a triumph of historicism over geography. But there you go. Sometimes this unimaginative technocrat actually wielded a historicist sense of how we wanted to shape his dominions also in a cultural sense. And the gesture of founding universities is also, this is what kings do. Because founding a university is a royal or a papal prerogative. Nowadays, I suppose any businessman can found a university and sort of become a diploma mill, but it was a tightly controlled business. And if you founded a university, it was usually you either were a monarch or you were claiming to be a monarch. And the two foundations that there were, Louvain and Leiden, were tricky enough. Louvain was founded in 1425 by the Dukes of Burgundy. Well, it was still a Duke of Brabant, but the Duke of Burgundy was already in waiting. And it was a signal of their monarchical ambitions that they decided to found a university. And it was not for nothing that the foundation of Louvain in 1425 was followed 5 years later by the foundation of the Order of the Golden Fleece. The Dukes of Burgundy were positioning themselves as first-rank players. And when William the Silent, the direct ancestor of William I, at least dynastically, founds Leiden, it is also a very, very overt act of rebellion against the Spanish king that he claims to have the power to found a university. This is part, I would say, of the dynastic memory of a reigning king when you found a university. The power play was something that is well established. I'm going to draw attention to two similar foundations in different parts of Europe. Granada, 1531, where Charles V founded a university after his honeymoon in the Alhambra, because Granada had only 20 or 50 years before, or less than that, 1492, been conquered from the last Moorish emir on Spanish soil. There were still a lot of Moriscos there. And in order to have a Christian think tank in this recently acquired piece of territory, bam, you put in a university, exactly like Strasbourg, 1871. And it's no different in Ireland in 1592 when Queen Elizabeth founds a Protestant university in order to have a power base for the Anglican Reformation in a recalcitrant Catholic country. So there is a lot of power play at work when you do that sort of thing. And then he sent this guy, and I'm supposed to be his successor. Nederduitse letterkunde en welsprekendheid, rhetoric and belles lettres, that is a very, very standard old-fashioned phrase for this type of chair. It just means cultural studies, basically. I think that's fair enough to say. People have taken a very poor view of him. So this is from Fernand Séverin, 1914. Comme plusieurs de ses compatriotes investis des mêmes fonctions dans les autres universités belges, Kinker avait pour mission spéciale de nous hollandiser, c'est-à-dire dans l'esprit du roi de nous polir, de nous civiliser. Les Hollandais à cette époque regardaient les Belges comme leur étant très inférieurs en culture. Tranchons le mot, ils les méprisaient. Now, this is exactly what I mean when I say that we look at 1817 through the lenses of the language politics that emerged after 1830, 1839. And maybe Kinker himself is at fault, because, you know, he wrote this absolutely idiotic poem from which we've taken the motto of our colloque today. He says goodbye to his native Amsterdam, and he goes into exile waar de Maas kronkelende opklimt tegen het Waalse Nederland. Daar gunt zij mij een veilige rustplaats aan haar rotsig, bochtig strand. Ik zal daar vlijtig gaan verkonden wat me in proza of in dicht hier verenigt, daar gebrokkeld op het woelig hartelicht. Ik zal er, hoe men aan mocht smagen, wat een afkeur of bedil, onze rijke Noordse tongval kennen doen aan wie maar wil. Zij ze Duitsers zijn of Fransen, Belgen, Walen of misschien de een of andere overvlieger die me in het Walenland wil zien. And then he goes on how he will teach people here to say "g" instead of "g." He goes into the phonetic. It's a totally grotesque poem, and you read and say, seriously, Johannes? You know, Kantian, Spinozist, were you serious about this? Liège was not Kinker's first choice. He was trying to get professorial chairs all over the place, and it, in the Rolling Stones versus Beatles tug of war between Bilderdijk and Kinker, it could be that he pulled the short end, he pulled the short match, and that he's trying to put bonne mine au mauvais jeu, and that he's trying to say, I have a civilizing task here. But I do not really think that Willem was a nation builder. He was a state builder, that's absolutely true. He was an Enlightenment absolutist, Prussian-style king who wanted to have canals, who wanted to have, sensible infrastructures, and who saw language as one of the infrastructures that needed to be rationalized. But there was nothing about the taaleschansed volk. I think I have a slight difference of emphasis with my colleagues like Vostos, who already see him as being slightly romantic about language. I don't think Willem was romantic about language. I think Kinker was. And look what happened to him. And I'm wondering, if I am supposed to be his successor, what does that say about me? Anyway, the plan not only failed to bear fruit, we've heard that a few times, it actually totally backfired. It backfired very badly thanks to a real compatriot of mine, Theodoor Leerssen. He was one of the few students who actually joined Tandem. He was very close to Kinker. He didn't have to learn Dutch from Kinker. That was his native language. I mean, Maastricht was a bi-trilingual city. His Dutch was a lot better than his French until he came to Liège. And what happened when he studied with Kinker in Liège, he learned proper French. So it didn't quite work out the way Kinker thought he would hollandiser les Wallons. No, it was the Maastrichtiens who were Wallonisés. And what Leerssen, and we see from, he became one of the great poets of the independent French-speaking country, with poems dedicated to progress like Le Remorqueur and Le Haut Fourneau. He's famous for that. A friend of Roger. And what he learned from Kinker was the, strongly Enlightenment. He takes us in a Saint-Simonian direction. He becomes really reformist, left-wing, and very, very democratic, and against the rule of kings. And this radicalism he takes back from Liège to his native Maastricht, where he becomes a lawyer after his law studies here, and where he becomes a rabid anti-Dutch agitator. Together with Annequin, he's a thorn in the side of the Dutch authorities, and he founds a French-language newspaper, L'Éclaireur de la Meuse, and nobody in Maastricht had any problem in reading French because, Maastricht was in an incipient stage of Frenchification, as most southern Netherlandic cities were at the time. Logically enough, when 1830 happens, Maastricht and all of the Département de la Meuse Inférieure, or the entire province of Limburg, chooses the southern side. They all hate the authoritarianism of Willem I. They have no sense of sympathy with the cult of the Reformation and the Golden Age and the Mauritshuis, so they all go the Belgian way. There are certain cities that the Dutch don't want to give up, specifically Antwerp and Maastricht, and they have strong garrisons in those cities. Chassé in Antwerp loses out, and Antwerp is conquered. Dibbets in Maastricht manages to keep the town. Maastricht is more or less besieged for 9 years from 1830 to 1839. All the rest of Limburg is Belgian, and by the time the Treaty of London is happening, we have a lot of very affecting, letters from the people in Limburg to King Leopold saying, please don't give us back to Holland, we love you so much, don't sell us down the river. But there's a bargaining chip. There will need to be a territorial link between Holland and Maastricht. There will have to be a buffer between the New Belgium and the German hinterland, and for both those reasons, Limburg is split in two, and the eastern half will remain Dutch. And this leads to an enormous brain drain of Limburg intellectuals into the New Belgium. Weustenraad is among them. He moves out of besieged Maastricht, and he will die in Jambes, part of Namur. This is what he writes about his ville natale. In 1838, I'll give you the first and the last stanzas. Te voilà donc assise au fond de la vallée, à genoux, les flancs nus, la tête échevelée et les deux bras meurtris. Priant et conjurant l'énochite de ton fleuve d'accueillir par pitié les plaintes d'une veuve et de te ramener les fils qui, trop prompts à te fuir pour sortir d'esclavage ou sur ses bords dépeuplés, t'ont laissé en otage aux oppresseurs de leur pays. C'est beau, hein? C'est presque musée. Oui, je me replonge, and this is how he ends with a bit of a hooray, and you see what inspires him. Je me replonge au sein de l'allégresse qui débordait à flot sur ton sol agité quand du canon liégeois la bouche vengeresse eut proclamé la fin d'un règne détesté. Un doux pressentiment ranime mon courage, mon cœur s'épanouit sous un souffle d'amour, et malgré les arrêts d'un sombre aréopage, je crois à ton bonheur, je crois à mon retour. So, this is how strongly anti-Dutch and Wallonized somebody like Weustenraad was. It was not quite what Kinker had intended when he moved down the Meuse. So what were the politics, and how did Willem try to make linguistic diversity manageable in his new realm? How did he try to rationalize the complex linguistic landscapes? Not, I think, in the sense that Kinker, rationalized his own mission with, but we get a better view if we see what the Royal Academy, which was also refounded in 1816 in Brussels, did about the thing. In 1821, a prize essay was promulgated asking for submissions on the question quelle est l'origine de la différence qui existe par rapport à langue entre les provinces dites flamandes et celles dites wallonnes. À quelle époque cette différence doit-elle être rapportée? Quelle est la raison que des contrées qui faisaient partie de la France parlent le flamand et d'autres qui appartenaient à l'Empire germanique se servent exclusivement de la langue française? This is typical for Willem's attitude. How is it possible that if you are under a French king, you speak Flemish? as certain parts of Flanders, who were feudally part under the French crown. And how is it possible, if like Liège, you are a independent land of the Holy Roman Empire, why don't you speak German if there's Wittelbach's in charge? So for Willem, it's a totally rational thing, and this is echoed here, that basically it's the state that forms the language. Not the 19th century idea that the language identifies the people and the people form the state. No, this is totally top-down. If you are a state, you have a certain language. And this leads to a number of interesting studies by people like Jonas Daniel Meyer from Amsterdam, who from Amsterdam will come up with a, let's say, not very cutting-edge analysis of l'usage de la langue flamande ou wallonne dans les Pays-Bas in 1825, but so a much more interesting intervention by the Hainaut or Namur, I'm not quite sure, Roux, a linguist who does a very interesting research to respond to the question. He gets the prize of the Academy. I would like to signal to begin with that what we get here in the 1820s is something new. Words like flamand and wallon are old. They're of long standing. They're not new inventions, but they begin to be used as antonyms, as two sides of a like Yip and Yannick, or the two things that go together. A sort of a double collocation where they are, seen as opposite quantities. And that is a new thing, and is peculiar to the Dutch attempts to understand the southern Netherlands. And I would say that here, the germs of the later antagonism are sown. But Roux comes up with what I think is one of the most sensible ways of looking at language geography I have ever seen. And I'm happy to be able to present it to you on this occasion, because I think it is a road not taken in language study and language politics in the southern Netherlands. What Roux does is, in effect, not looking at language differences or language frontiers. He doesn't do isoglosses on a map to say, north of this is where they do this, where they say dorp, and south of this is where they say village. Instead, what he does is he measures unilingualism, monolingualism. And he works not from the territory, but from the nodal points, the cities in the territories. Knowing that every city has complex hinterlands around it, he says, I'm going to look at the cities that historically only conducted their official business in French. And I'm going to look at the cities that only conducted their official business in Netherlandic. And I'm going to draw a line between the southernmost cities that were unilingually, monolingually Netherlandic, and I'm going to draw a line between the northernmost cities that were totally Romance. And so we get two roughly parallel lines. One running from Calais to Longwy, and one running from Luxembourg to Bourbourg. And in between, there is a zone where you say there was no unilingualism there. This was a road not taken in language geography. When later on people will start to map language differences geographically, they will look at linear front lines where one language bumps against the other. And they will do some cross-hatching if there's interpenetration, but that's the anomaly. I think this was a much more sensible approach. And had it been followed in the 19th century in order to deal with, the distribution of languages, people might have learned to live with the notion that languages don't have frontiers. They have transition zones. So anyway, that's how Roux does it. And what we get as a result of this in the following decades are shifting identity articulations, ethnonyms, identifications, how people classify their culture in this complex, modeled, shifting territory. Belgisch, Vlaams, Hollands are continuous, but there are new antonyms, new oppositions, Vlaams-Waals and Vlaams-Hollands. These are very often used in a contrasting way. The two words Nederlands and Nederduits, Nederduits being in the formulation of Kinker's task, also have a long prehistory. They are used for language, for church organizations, Nederduits gereformeerd. You can trace them back as a self-appellation for a long time. They remain in use in the 19th century. But Nederduits, Nederlands is definitely pushed as the new identity after 1815, beginning with Tollens's Wie Nederlands bloed. So it's a branding of the new state. And Nederlands is definitely the new realm of Willem I. And Nederduits is slowly beginning a decline. When Willem I reforms the Dutch Protestant Church, he will call it from Nederduits gereformeerd into Nederlands hervormd. And that shift from Nederduits to Nederlands is summer. Janneke, we've had a little discussion about this, but I'll stick to my guns. I would say that after 1830, the slow decline of Nederduits, which nowadays is not used anymore, runs in asymmetrical trajectories north and south. In 1830, Nederduits is definitely revived as an appellation for the language because, you know, people speaking the Dutch language do not want to call their language Nederlands, which is now claimed by the polity which they just seceded from. So we see at Nederduits, a lot of appellations Nederduits continuing in force in Flanders for a long time, whereas the decline is more rapid in the northern half of the country. But what we also get are new ethnonyms, completely new appellations, almost what you might call an ethnogenesis. To begin with, there's the strange notion of diets. The word diets, which will lead later on to this strange and rather shady ideology of the Greater Netherlandism, is brought into circulation by Jongbloed in knowledge production. The original spelling was Duits, but he prefers diets in order not to be German. By Bormans, who had been here for a while, a guy from former Prince-Bishopric of Liège, active here at this university. Leven van Sinte Christina in Oud-Dietse rijmen, and Alberding Time will start the periodical De Dietse Warande. So Diets is pushed as something which unites two communities that are now separate, namely the Netherlandic-speaking Flemish part of Belgium and the Netherlands, but excluding the Walloons. So it's a new category and they need a new word for it, and it can't be German, because they're beginning to be a bit worried about the eastern neighbor as well, so they call it Diets as opposed to Duits. And that is definitely a new type of ethnonym. Another new appellation is Wallon. We've seen it in informal usage as the people who do not speak Flemish, and the Quartier Wallon is an appellation for certain territories. But now it becomes a specific demarcation of a language community, of a community of speakers. After Roux, we see suddenly how it increases. It's very strong with uncle and nephew Grand Gagnage here in Liège. François Charles Joseph Grand Gagnage in his Wallonade basically opposes a Walloon robust character against both the French, he doesn't like Jules Michelet, and against the Flemings, he doesn't like Jan Frans Willems. And between the two is that sort of Chanchez, who is a Wallon. And his nephew will do knowledge production, and you know, he's not le premier venu, because his Dictionnaire de la langue wallonne will really inspire Dietz, the great Romance linguist who is himself a pupil of Grimm, and people who do la langue wallonne are taken serious by the premier philologists, and they don't say dialect, they say langue wallonne. I will say something about Limburg later on, but first of all have a look at the intensity of Walloon specific, let's call it particularism or an ethnogenesis, how the Walloon part of Belgium wants to actually proclaim, articulate, identify its cultural presence. It goes with a great cult of the 600 Franchimontois, historical novels produced in great number. Societies founded in 1834, of course, the Association pour l'encouragement et le développement de la littérature en Belgique. But later on, halfway down, you will see that Grand Gagnage also founds a, this is Société Liégeoise de Littérature Wallonne. And by the end of the century, you will also get a revival of dialect literature. And also what you can see is a transition from first a cultural self-articulation to what then becomes an articulation in sociability. Societies are founded, and then Congrès Wallon are held, and we gradually, against the Flemish movement, in what is a typical case of hostile imitation, we get a Walloon movement, and they will hold their first congresses in Brussels, in Namur, in Liège, in Mons, and finally the word Wallonie is instrumentalized in Destrée, and the movement becomes political. So we see a run-up to a real Walloon movement, and the word is new. It's a bit of a neologism in applying it so strongly to a cultural community. The Walloons were reacting not only against the Flemish movement, but also against Walter Scott, who had put Liège on the literary map in his novel Quentin Durward of 1823. Which describes a young Scottish soldier in the service of Louis XII, suddenly falling into the great battle between the Sangliers des Ardennes and Prince Bishop Louis of Bourbon and the citizens of Liège. And he describes the Cité Ardente, and no, he doesn't describe it as a Cité Ardente. That's the strange thing. It is really as Liégeois as the theme gets. It really thematizes everything. But if you look at what he calls it, the citizens have names like Peterkin Gieslaar, Nickel Blok, and there's a Jungfrau called Trutchen, and they run along the canals, and basically it's not a Bruges-la-Morte but a Bruges-Ardente. So he just hasn't done his homework. He has no idea what Liège looks like, but in 1823, hey, it's one of those Willem I Dutch cities, so it'll look a bit like Ghent and Bruges. And I think the Liégeois were hopping mad about this. And so as the Flemings are cultivating their Lion of Flanders and doing their historicist thing, the Walloons are both trying to, compete with the Flemings and trying to contradict Walter Scott and saying the 600 Franche-Montois, it was different. Okay, back to Limburg. In his nostalgia for the city from which he had been exiled, Weustenraad, Kinker's pupil, also wrote a poem in Maastricht dialect, in patois, in the city dialect of Maastricht. And it's an anti-clerical, obscene, libertine satire, full of scenes of fornication and, vomiting priests and what have you. It's really rank. And as a result, it was, a succès de scandale in the 19th century. And now that we are a bit more broadly minded in our taste, people recognize it's a crown jewel of the dialect literature of Limburg. It's very anti-clerical, even though it's regionalist. And in its theme, it thematizes the pilgrims of Maastricht going to Scherpenheuvel, and it's part of a vogue where poets are beginning to look at pilgrimages very quizzically. So Heinrich Heine writes Die Wallfahrt nach Kevelaar, and the Luxembourg poet in Luxembourg patois, in Letzeburgisch, writes De Bidgang naar Canton. I would like to speak the language here of the man whose true successor I feel myself to be. I'm not the successor to Kinker, I'm the successor to Weustenraad. And Weustenraad, to give you an idea of how he writes his dialect and what his attitude is, I'm taking one which is only mildly saucy. It's the Nuda Veritas, and I'll read it in Maastricht, and you can read along in Dutch to get a sense of it. Nog wilt men nu en dan de woerheid een humme flikken, het lief. Ik vind mijn ziel dat gans onnuzel. De woerheid is ja geen uitwief, het is een jong en wulps vrommes. Och, zie niet geur vuil liever bloed. Ze speelt wel eens te hoors omwille, en ze is niet bang voor een stoet. En eerlijk heeft met haar geslapen, en niemand is van haar voldaan. En eerlijk heeft aan haar borst gelegen, en niemand heeft het goed gedaan. Veel anderen heeft me haar verlaten, maar zij spant nog altijd te groen. De anderen zijn lelijk en oud geworden, en zij blijft altijd jong en schoon. This is the Saint-Simonian, praise of truth as a sexy woman. I actually must say, I admit I like this. So it's more than just a piece of carnivalesque obscenity. There are some real nice things in that. And it alerts us to something interesting in this idea that we get a strange combination both in Luxembourg dialect and in Limburg dialect, where city dialect is used either to invoke local traditions like pilgrimages, and at the same time these poets are highly aware of technological progress. So underlined are dialect productions, and besides the processions, there's Le Remorqueur, Le Haut Fourneau, and also the Fire One by Michel Lenz, the Fire One, the fiery wagon, meaning the railway. It celebrates the linking up of Luxembourg with the railway system. What links Limburg and Luxembourg, I think, is the omitted middle of Liège. And here is where I'd like to see Liège as the city which Maastricht and Luxembourg are excluded from by the power politics of the Congress of London. There are a lot of parallels. I need to move to my end, and we'll see them both in the notion of sociability and in cultural production. So the Société Liégeoise de la Littérature Wallonne and the plays in Walloon that are produced towards the end of the century have a parallel in Maastricht and Roermond, where there are French language Société Dramatique de Roermond, précisément Roermond, and the Société Momus in Maastricht, but Kindermerkske, de Kaptein van Köpenick, and also dialect studies. And in Luxembourg there's the same thing about Luxembourg language production and learned sociability. In the course of the 19th century, identity articulations in Limburg, which is contre-cœur Dutch, will move from identity articulations in Limburg towards articulations of Limburg identity. Somebody like Weusterath felt about Maastricht the way Vondel felt about Amsterdam. His native country was his city. Towards the end of the century, you see that the appellations of Roermond, Maastricht, the city-specific appellations, merge more and more into the regional appellation Limburgs. I am not going to follow it in detail. You have to take my word for it, or you take a snapshot of what I'm saying here. And interestingly enough, that means that the attraction of the Netherlandic state is so weak that it is possible for a subsidiary system, a Limburg provincial regional identity, to form under the aegis of the Dutch state, and a Limburg imaginaire is formulated by another exile who went to Eeklo, Pieter Ikrevisse, who formulated all the stereotypical traits with which Limburg identity has been credited ever since. However, there are also divergences. In Liège, city dialect weakens into a mere signaling language. It's used, it's invoked rather than is actively used in social intercourse. And the Liège-Walloon identity and the Walloon movement is subsumed into a Belgian francophonie as whatever is non-Flemish in Belgium. There's very few real, if you like, Walloon autonomists who don't say we're different from the francophonie. There's Brussels and Liège, of course, but it's not linguistic. In Maastricht-Roermond, the city dialects remain very, very robust and are still used. And they merge and they rusticate into Limburg regionalism. And they become submerged into verzuiling. The liberal Saint-Simonian tradition, imported from Liège, disappears, and instead region and country are opposed in terms of Catholic, ultramontanist versus Protestant. And in Luxembourg there's the happenstance that a city dialect used only for carnivalesque purposes becomes purely by accident a national language and then consolidates itself because of the geopolitical tensions that the country goes through in the first decades of its independence. That's very different from what happened around Barcelona, where the jocs florals, the jeux floraux, proliferated in a reticulation of cities, from La Coruña to Montpellier, all starting from Toulouse, and where this cultural festival in a network of cities, a sort of Eurovision, could lead to the very, very strenuous confrontation we have nowadays. These were the things I wanted to explore. A few notions of how nation formation elbows regional and city identities out of the way, how cities react, certainly if they're marginalized and put on close to the borders of the new languages. And that is just a way of looking at it. So let's not look at binaries like Flemish and Walloon or Belgian and Holland. It's a multi-scalar, multi-level, very complex set of nesting, sometimes contradictory, sometimes compatible, sometimes subsidiary self-identifications, which are all played out through cultural production. I have to end my inaugural lecture by what is done in Holland as the word of thanks, and there's a little tradition about that. You're supposed to do that in your native language. And so let me do that right now. Ik bedank de Leukse Universiteit en de Hollandse ambassade in het Belgisch voor het vertrouwen wat ze in me gesteld hebben. Ik bedank de leuke heren voor het warme en collegiale welkom. Je vous remercie de votre attention. Thank you very much.